This phone took what we knew about mobile phones and turned it completely on its head. It took a wildly different approach to the models before, and it paved the way for what we carry around in our pockets almost 10 years later. For all its pitfalls, this will go down as a seriously legendary device. It might have the most iconic ad campaign outside of Apple. Lemaitre's Closer running in the background went so hard, and I remember thinking, I have to have that phone. It's one of the few I've ever bought brand new on launch. I remember absolutely adoring the genesis of the Pixel. See, up until this phone came out, so many companies like Samsung and LG seemed to think that hardware was the way forward. You all remember the Galaxy Zoom, LG's G Flex, and models from other manufacturers trying to evolve quality in raw hardware. Google showed the world that you didn't need to put ginormous camera sensors or outlandish displays in phones to really make them great. But this is where I think a lot of people get the Pixel wrong. By the way, it'd be great if you could subscribe. Cheers guys. So the de facto line for the Pixel, including this first generation actually, is it's all software, no hardware. And that's just wrong. See, the original Pixel was pretty stout for the time. It had the best of the best Snapdragon 821 chip, 4 gigs of RAM, and a high-end OLED display. It was actually pretty quick on a charge too. Sure, this camera looks pretty tiny and insignificant now, but it wasn't a tiny sensor in 2016. In fact, it was roughly the same size as the sensor you'd find in Pixel models all the way up to and including the 5th generation. The Pixel and Pixel XL models were statement phones. They were built to let the people know that Google was serious about making phones. Though these, I believe, were manufactured by HTC. I believe the whole software over hardware thing was slowly introduced and developed on as the Pixel smartphone line developed. Of course, the headline feature of this phone, as you all know by now, is its immense camera. But Google's HDR+ software, which is much of what made up this insane camera, wasn't new with the Pixel and actually was available on the Nexus 6P with the same camera hardware. But where you'd have a hard time trying to find someone who knew what a Nexus was outside of the tech space, the Pixel was bold and advertised absolutely everywhere. And Google wasn't holding back in any situation, with shots at other phones losing the headphone port in its debut ad, just to abandon it a year later, and the original Pixel was the same price as the iPhone 7. Not cheap, especially for a first-gen product. Again, Google made a statement with its Pixel. The camera was incredibly impressive. The mainstream hadn't seen a smartphone that could capture so much dynamic range before. The quality of its images with lifted shadows and detail across the entire scene was a novelty. And of course this aesthetic would capture the market. Now seemingly every single smartphone flattens images so you can see huge amounts of detail across the whole shot. It could capture Ultra HD 4K 30p video and had a solid portrait mode to go with. The camera's colours were natural, the tones were bold, and it's not like what we had seen out of Samsung, Apple, Huawei and LG at the time. On reflection, it is quite interesting that Google managed to wow and capture its audience with image quality alone. I mean, it's not like we had, Top Shot, Night Sight, Add Me, any kind of AI modes like we have these days. It was all image quality. And those modes are what Google's leaning pretty heavily on in its marketing to sell its latest Pixel smartphones, which of course all have better hardware than this. This was of course the debut of Pixel Experience, not necessarily stock Android, but a very stripped back setup compared to what we've been seeing from the competing Korean models. In fact, I feel like Pixel Experience streamlined and fresh feeling almost forced the likes of Samsung to refine its software. Who here remembers how bulky TouchWiz was? Samsung actually already had Samsung Experience out by the time the Pixel came about, and then a couple of years later, finally we'd have a mature One UI. So it wasn't exactly the catalyst, but probably didn't do much harm in the process. The original Pixel came with Android 7 Nougat, and it would receive its final update to Android 10. It's still pretty usable today, but to be honest, I'm not sure I'd recommend anyone buy one of these and try and use it as their daily driver. I don't know, let me know in the comments if that's an experiment you run. It still takes some pretty decent photos though, so not that bad in that respect. The thing is, this was an absolute beast when it came out. Performance and battery life wise, as long as you picked the larger XL model because it had the bigger battery, it was phenomenal, and it kept up and surpassed a lot of the already established flagships in raw processing power, which is a serious contrast to what we have today with the likes of the Pixel 9 Pro. With Google's lackluster Tensor chips, 4 generations in, they still can't compete with Snapdragon, which is kind of ironic really. Whether it was by design or just serendipity, the big empty chasmic bezels surrounding the display up front forced you to focus on what was going on inside the frame. It didn't matter if that was using the still pretty fresh Google Assistant, taking photos with that beautiful camera app, or even bypassing Google's own features and just browsing Instagram or Facebook at the time. This is a philosophy we'd later find in other Google models. Sure, bezels have become, well, practically non-existent these days, and the designs have got a little more complex and creative, but the focus is still hugely on what's going on inside the screen borders. Though now, of course, we have stuff like Pixel Studio, Google Gemini, the insanely useful suite of augmentation tools in Google's Photos app, and most people just scroll through short-form videos like it's their job these days. As the average person's screen time has increased, it feels like the Pixel has focused more on that. Maybe it's the other way around, maybe it's just coincidence, but it almost feels like it all started here with these massive bezels. And its design was, well, divisive to say the least. I still don't know if this is really ugly or really good looking, even a decade after its release. It almost is like a development unit in the way that it looks. It looks like there's so much vast, open, empty space that this was made for people to develop on and to focus on the internal hardware, and then Google later down the line might refine it. It's almost like Google never finished that whole process, and well, I don't know, maybe it's iconic. Let me know in the comments on this one. Computational photography and the focus on compute as a whole is now clearly a thing that Samsung and Apple alongside Google are doing. And look at how Google would later go on to pioneer AI in its phones, where Apple and Samsung have been forced to adapt and adopt this feature set on their phones. None of the current crop of flagship devices from these guys really push the boundaries in terms of raw hardware, and many of us have been dabbling in Chinese export scenes for our fix for truly cutting edge tech, stuff like crazy fast charging, huge camera sensors, all that kind of stuff, plus a little additional bonuses like an IR blaster for example. But this wasn't the case with the original Pixel. Sure, it started the trend, but it also didn't rely on software to carry, quite frankly, outdated hardware like the big three are doing these days. Is that representative of the world that we're living in? Nah, it's a bit too late in the week to get philosophical like that, but I stand by the idea that when this phone came out, it was never software only. I think the Pixel line has developed and matured immensely. Look, there are still enthusiasts that lament the poor chips and the hardware that just misses the top shelf. But when you realise that user experience is above specs and you use a Pixel for what it is, it's one of the best smartphone experiences you can have. And that all started here. The original Google Pixel was the company telling the world that it was here and ready to compete with the biggest smartphone manufacturers in the space. It changed how we see smartphones and how companies design and build them.